I'm in a hive.
You are in the heart of the hive.
I am in the hive. It's all vacant right now. There's nobody here with me. As you can see, all the comb's empty.
That's probably a good thing.
That is an image that I actually took when I was doing a removal from inside of a cubby storage compartment in a travel camper.
Oh,
So you
nice.
you open up the outside door and there was all this comb, and they had kind of abandoned that outer comb closest to the door and moved
Mhm.
deeper into the actual cavity. And so when I first opened it up, I was able to get a couple of really nice photos of just the comb. And then that has become my background on this and on my business cards and all that fun stuff. So
Yeah. It's the Hive Jive,
yeah, yeah, it's the Hive
background on
Jive.
the page.
That's right. It's the logo. It's the background logo for the Hive Jive as well.
Right.
So let's see. Other things of note for everybody listening on audio. It might sound a little odd. We've been playing with some of the settings and stuff. Natalie has Bluetooth headsets with mics in today, and it's giving a different sound than what you might have heard in the weeks past. So just wanted to make that a point so that everybody wasn't like, what the hell are you doing?
Mhm.
We do have a couple listeners that are audiophiles that will comment on certain things.
The quality of
They're
the
like,
sound.
so your intro music was a little bit louder than the volume of your speaking voices whenever it started, or like, I'm all right, right, got it. We're being picky today. So
Well, it's a good thing that people let you know, but sometimes it's hard for us to do anything about it, and at least until the next time.
yeah, especially when we're doing things remote and virtually like this, when you're dealing with technology, you've got all kinds of different things, and any little adjustment or change in equipment will change all of that as well. So
Which is what happened, right? I have a very old computer, and I had an old headset that finally gave up on me. So I'm working with Bluetooth, and that's part of the issue.
yeah, but that's all right. We will figure it out.
Yep.
So for today, um, I think I can't remember which order we did what in, but one of our last two episodes that came out on the Beekeeper Chats was talking about immunizations and treatment free and kind of like the parallels to that. So this one kind of goes in line with it. We are going to talk today about the actual immune system of the bees and the colony and kind of how that works. And we just kind of figured it would be a good kind of segue over into that because, what is the bee's immune system? How does it specifically function? How does it
Mm-hmm.
help? And how is the colony's immune system versus the bee's immune system? Because we do view the bee as just a cell inside the body of a greater organism. So
Mm-hmm.
there's lots of different aspects to that, defenses that they can use. And this area of expertise is not necessarily my area of expertise. So we're going to let you do a lot of talking on this one
Oh,
today.
great.
Yeah. And so what I will say though is from a very high overview perspective on the bee, their fat bodies are actually kind of what produce and store is it vitellogenin? It
Vitellogenin.
vitellogenin.
I'm
Okay.
gonna say it right. Vitellogenin. I don't know if it's a V or Vi, but
Yeah,
vitellogenin.
okay. So that substance is actually, it does a lot of different things, especially in females and like ovary and egg production and things like that. But it also is a key factor in the bee's immune system. But another key point of the bee's immune system is actually that it's primarily focused on their esophageal tract. The esophagus, when they consume food and it goes down through that tract to the stomach, that's where the majority of their immune system is actually located. And that's one of the problems that some things like mites, for instance, have caused, is because when the mite bites the bee, it is actually circumventing that original tract of the immune system. So the body's not able to fight it off as easily
Mhm.
as it would if there was something that they were consuming. So that right there, in a nutshell, is the sum total of my bee immune knowledge.
Well, you do make some good points though, because it's kind of like instead of going through the digestive tract and getting through the microbiome in the stomach of the bees and getting that immune response from the gut, basically, like just like kind of like mammals do, you end up bypassing that and putting those viruses directly into the bloodstream. of the bee, into the body of the bee through the fat bodies and also some of the hemolymphs, the blood of the bees. So that transmission is unabated. It's just basically unhindered and bypasses all the defense mechanisms that the microbiome in the gut offers. So that's an excellent point. And that's part of the issues with the mites and the viruses that it transmits. So
yeah, definitely. And it's still, you know, we talked about it in the other episode that trying to fight an insect on an insect that is a parasite is a very, very tricky thing to do. But there are ways that we can help the bees by helping either work with their natural immune responses or the way that their colony would address different type of immune response to things. There's different ways that we can go through and help them to try to make it a little bit better. For instance, so one of the things we talk about a lot in, well, we've talked about it in the podcast several times, but like the wax itself kind of acts like the bee's kidneys. It pulls toxins away from the bees, but the propolis actually acts as a different faceted aspect of the bee colony. So yeah, it's the glue and it's the sticky stuff and it's what they use to fuse everything together. But by coating the entire inside of their cavity with that, it is actually acting as an antibiotic, an antimicrobial, antifungal. It goes through and it disinfects, antiviral, exactly. So it helps go through and protect the colony by things that could get in and spread throughout the inside of the colony. And we, through the things that humans love to do, we have unfortunately hindered the bees in a lot of aspects, because if you are a commercial beekeeper and you don't rotate out your comb, that comb gets uber black and nasty. And then it ends up becoming super saturated and leaching those toxins back out into the food and into the larva. And on the other aspect of it, from just a standardized beekeeping approach, propolis is a pain in the butt to work with. And when you have colonies that over propolize things, it does make it more difficult to get in there. So breeders have purposefully selected for bees that don't have the tendency to propolize as much, thereby reducing some of their natural immune responses or ways to combat these types of pathogens from getting access into the colony.
Right. And before I forget, some of those aspects of beekeeping that we do usually with, especially when you're removing the entire roof of a colony and exposing the bird's nest and just kind of like exposing it to the air and the atmosphere, the bees have a very tight, basically, and inner system in there. They maintain a very tight temperature, humidity levels, but also, and a lot of people don't really know that, there's a lot of volatile compounds that are in that bird's nest, mostly from propolis, that are maintaining a healthy environment, a sterile environment for the brood. That whenever we open and disrupt that balance, we're really decreasing the amount of immunity at the bird level. So that's kind of something that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about propolis, is that it's not just at the surface and contact level, it's also in the atmosphere in the bird's nest that it becomes a very important tool for the bees to keep the bird's nest clean. Now, you know, the superorganism versus the individual bee, there's a lot of things that are happening on a spectrum, from what is called something permanent prophylactic, that is constantly there in the colony, which is called constitutive. It's part of its constitution. It's always there, and it serves as a background immunity. Things like polyandry, the simple fact that the queen is going to go and breed with several drones, is going to be part of that system. And the more she's mated, the more diversity in genetics she's going to bring in, the more patrilines and subfamilies are going to be present in the colony, and the more they're going to be able to implement those strategies at the colony level and defend them from pathogens and viruses that they can find outside of the hive. And then on the other hand of the spectrum, you have strategies that are inducive, meaning that they only are used or in higher levels when problems arise, and they're more adaptative. they're just going to be bringing in more propolis. They're going to do more of certain things in a voluntary way to take care of some of those issues with problems that have been arising in viruses and pathogens. So if you think about that continuum spectrum, you have on the extreme the constitutive, the always there, prophylactic. You have that polyandry. That's going to be really the key to having a healthy colony. That's really where you want to start. And that means that you really want to start with well-mated queens that are local, preferably. I know we come back always to the same thing, and I tend to get on my soapbox about it, but local, very well-mated queens, and they're going to be more resilient and more adapted to the environment and more resistant to the viruses that pests and pathogens can expose them to. So that also gives them, all the individual bees will have a better gut microbiota. That immune system at the gut level that we were talking about is going to be more present and more diverse, and that's going to help them with that. There's also a better immunocompetency from that standpoint, because they're going to be more able to resist the viruses that they're encountering, but also they're going to be able to, when they do encounter some of those viruses, they're going to be able to lower the level of infections. So all that is playing together. But there's also, we can talk about other things, because there's also, on that spectrum, you're going to have the task allocation, the polyasism, the change of, they start as nurses and they end up as foragers. There's we talked about the propolis, there's the hygienic behavior, there's all kinds of different things that happen increasingly in a more controlled way as we go and problem arise.
Yeah, so on the gut biome and the microbiome in the gut, just like for us, for people, it is very important to have lots of pre and probiotics in your diet, and eating a natural, healthy diet, not eating an overly processed diet, is more beneficial for people, because when you do that, you are picking up these natural pro and prebiotics that are naturally occurring on the fruits and vegetables and things like that. When you buy stuff that is overly processed, it's not only is it devoid of the nutritional value that you need, but it's also devoid of those other things. And it's the same concept for the bees. If they go out and they're foraging and they're collecting nectar, that nectar is going to have some of these naturally occurring elements and biotics in it. When they collect natural pollen from the flowers, it's going to have that naturally occurring different sets of things to it that they can then bring back to the colony. And as they go through and they make their brood food and everything else, and they make their bee bread, those naturally occurring things are what actually goes to help support that microbiome inside their body. If you're feeding them a protein substitute or a pollen substitute, or you're feeding them just pure sugar syrup or corn syrup, not only are they missing out on the vitamin and mineral aspects and the diversity of that they would find in nature, they're also missing out on the pre and probiotics. So if you are in a situation where you absolutely must feed for whatever reason, keep that in mind, because they are starting to become more mindful out there on these topics, and they do start now to provide pre and probiotics that you can use if you have to mix into some of those other substances. But that is a very key element on, I pick on commercial beekeepers a lot, because they put the bees on the trucks, they truck them across the country. They don't let them keep any of their natural food stores. They immediately take it away, pump them full of artificial substances, and pack them on out there. And in the winter, they pack them full of protein patties, pollen patties, so that they'll brood up quicker, so they can be ready to go to these massive crops of almonds and such. And those bees are typically the ones that suffer the most. They're usually the weakest. They're the ones that you have those highest death rates on over winter and during the summer months and things. So it's very important that you make sure that you have all of these key aspects in play like they should be. And obviously, letting nature take its course and doing the most natural approach is always going to be the best, because then the bees can find what they need and help supplement the things that they need.
Yeah, it's important to trust the colony and the bees to do some of those things on their own, because they've been developing those strategies for millions of years, And there's a whole variety of strategies that they're using that we might actually be interfering with when we put any foreign substances into the hive. Like you mentioned, those artificial supplements are void of the good stuff that they can find in their natural food sources. An example, you were mentioning the sugar syrup. Well, when they are foraging on nectar, those contain antimicrobial compounds that, like the alkaloids, that are actually part of the chemical compounds that they're using to keep the colony healthy. So it's always better to let them do that. To have a strong immune system is what we want for our bees, and reducing the stress that we expose them to, just like, in some cases it's impossible. If you're doing commercial beekeeping and you're doing pollination contracts and you're transporting them, it's going to be really hard to do. And that's why commercial beekeepers tend to use more medication than backyard beekeepers who don't have to do that necessarily. And that the main thing that you can do is make sure that they are low stress, and that means keeping them in good nutrition environments, low toxicity environments. So you want good forage, you want low pesticides from agriculture, you want lower monocultures, you want more diversity in your forage. Things like that. Don't go in there too often, and all those things that you can do to lower the stress level is going to improve their immunity and their health in the end. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing I wanted to mention that's really exciting and fascinating to me is that they're using that division of labor, that temporal polytheism, which means when they're younger, a certain age category, they're going to do specific type of tasks, like nursing or working on the capping of the brood and all that stuff. And then as they get older, they progress further out and away from the brood's nest and towards the entrance. They turn into guards, and then they start foraging. And there's a natural separation and compartmentalization from the foragers and the brood nest, meaning they're going to keep those foragers that are exposed to a lot of pathogens and diseases and viruses and things away from the babies, which is smart. They're keeping them away from the nursery, and instead they're going to use those younger bees that are not exposed to the outside to do those work. So the younger the bee, the more inside she works with the brood and with the queen, and the older she is, the more she's going to be away from them and work outside. So there's a buffering of the queen and the brood, basically. And that's a very important strategy that they're using as well. So we need to be very careful when we're manipulating and taking out frames of brood to boost another colony, to make sure that we're not doing that in an excessive way, and always very mindfully, because what happens is when we've got, we remove a frame of brood, we disrupt the balance of new bees coming in into the hives, taking care of those tasks, and we're forcing potentially some of those foragers to go back and revert to being nurses, which would negatively impact the health of the brood's nest.
Yeah.
So all those things we need to be very mindful about when we do any kind of intervention on the colony.
Some of the other things when it comes to, like, divisions and subcategories of things, that single bee approach, if you look at the single individual bee and the single bee mindset of it, if an individual bee does end up contracting something and coming down with it and getting sick and ill, literally they will choose the betterment of the colony over their own safety and health, and they will remove themselves from the situation. So that bee will leave the colony. Those are oftentimes ones that you see drunkenly wandering around out in front of a hive somewhere, or just randomly out in the middle of nowhere, a bee on the ground and it's not flying and it's not doing anything. A lot of times that's why they do have something wrong with them, or they feel there's something wrong with them. So they have flown off, because if they take that away with them, it lessens the chance of them accidentally spreading it to the rest of the colony. And so that's one of the ways as well that they go through and they help that out. Now, on a human perspective of that, we tend to like to add emotion to things that maybe should or should not be there. And there was a big push here a few years ago about, oh, save the bees. Like if you see a bee out there on the concrete, it needs a drink or it needs this, and feed it sugar syrup. And so you don't ever want to do that, because if you are feeding them something, one, it may not be the healthiest thing out there for them. And two, there may be a very good reason why that bee is there. Picking a bee up off the ground that looks like it's obviously distressed and placing it back into the colony is actually defeating the purpose of what that bee was trying to do. It was making a sacrifice to keep the colony healthy. And if you turn around and you're like, oh, you poor thing, you're lost, let me
I
help you,
know.
and you put it back, you're actually inserting that disease or pathogen that it was trying to
Back
remove
into,
back into the colony. So there's
yeah.
little things like that that we have to be aware of as well.
It's actually called, I think, altruistic suicide. To your point, it's a very selfless kind of a way to sacrifice themselves for the good of the colony, and interfering with that is never a good thing. The other thing that so they will take themselves out, but also some of the bees, the undertakers, will help out with the ones that are not taking themselves out. And if they're sick and unwelcome in a way anymore, they'll take them out as well. So there's those two components for that altruistic behavior. I mean, that basically self-cleaning of the colony from diseased bees. That self-removal can be a little bit helped by some of the undertakers there.
It can, yeah, it can help out.
A little nudge.
It's kind of like how they help out with the drones at certain times of the year too. It's like,
Yeah,
you
kicking
can't
them
be
out.
here anymore. You gotta go.
It's not so gentle though. I mean, I've
No.
seen it happen, and it's pretty brutal actually.
Yeah,
But
I've seen it.
yeah, so the that's more on the ad hoc, like, oh, something's happening, we're gonna pluck them out as we need to be. But if we go back a little bit more on the constitutive, on the prophylactic, there's also all kinds of things that happens at the individual bee level as well. For example, on their cuticle, they have venom peptides that are basically antimicrobial and disinfectants for the bees. So on their body, on the outside of their bodies, they will have a layer of basically disinfecting, antiviral, anti-everything. Those venom, those peptides offer protection around their body. So, and then they will also they use that trophallaxis to inoculate the brood. Basically, you know, that gut microbiota, that's also part of the trophallaxis, and the exchange of those protective compounds, those antimicrobial compounds, through that regurgitation and exchange of those foods and the stomach products, basically horizontally between every single individual bees and the larvae that they're feeding, but also that can also be done at the vertical level when the queen is passing down some of the stuff and their progeny. So it's a very interesting way for them to use antimicrobial compounds to provide the level of immunity at the colony level, even though it's produced at the bee level. There's other things so we talked about the trophallaxis and the inoculation of the microbiota, but there's also they secrete glucose oxidase. So I had to look that one up. I'll be honest with you. They secrete glucose oxidase, which is an enzyme with antiseptic properties. So that provides that's transferred all over the colony. That's also going to provide a level of immunity from that standpoint. So they're multi-pronged approach, both at the prophylactic level and more at the and at the group level and at the individual level and as needed. So they've got all kinds of strategies to take care of issues and pests and pathogens at the colony level. The propolis, so they collect propolis and they will use that. We talked about it a little bit. That's also as we get further out into the ad hoc. But my favorite thing is really that protective atmosphere when they're in the bird's nest and they're using those volatile compounds to make that atmosphere. Apparently that actually increases the brood survival, but also that also extends the adult life expectancy of survival. So that's a very important thing that not many beekeepers think about when they crack open a hive. So you shouldn't do it too often. You shouldn't too much in the brood's nest, and preferably on the very small scale, which, you know me, I'll get on my soapbox and I'll say that's easier to do in a top bar hive than it is in a Langstroth hive where you crack the entire cover open.
Or, I mean, so you could have some modifications to that if it is like a long laying or a lay-ins, and you've got partitioned covers that are still enclosing and covering up certain areas. Then you can go through and kind of keep it like a top bar would be. But that's also why in a top bar, we usually start at the back. We don't usually start right in the middle of the bird's nesters to the front. We start at the back and we go forward until we find what we're looking for. And if you find that
the edge,
Yeah, if you find that 3 or 4 bars in, you're done. You don't need to continue going in and
That's
opening that
right.
up. And so it helps keep all those the atmospheric conditions that they have worked so hard to create. You know, it's temperature, it's humidity, it's all the volatile compounds that you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And so on the volatile compound part, the propolis still is a very fascinating thing to me because
That's amazing.
it's just like when we talk about food, and I still can't stress the mind-boggling aspect of this enough. The bees can actually detect to a molecular level different substances. And when they
Mm-hmm.
are short a specific amino
Yes.
acid, they actually go look for that amino acid. And
It-
they do the same thing when they're out there looking for propolis. They purposely select things that are the most toxic, and they
mhm.
take them and mix them together and create this chemical
Potion.
recipe of goop that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
is perfectly balanced to where it doesn't harm them, but it harms all the things around them. And
Mm-hmm.
that is it's a fascinating thing that they can actually use. Now, there's one little adjunct to this that doesn't necessarily have to do with viruses and things along those lines, but it does have to do with predation and pests. And they've
Mm-hmm.
used the same types of things to go through and ward off some of the giant Asian hornets by going out and selecting the most foul feces they can
Mm-hmm.
find and
Yes, I've heard that.
strategically placing it around the entrance of their colony to both mask their pheromones and ward off the hornets, because it's something that they're not really keen on and they know the hornets aren't either, and so they've purposely selected these things. So they're actually highly intelligent when it comes to what they're doing and why. And a lot of times we just need to follow their lead and listen to the bees, because there is
Mm-hmm.
a reason, there's a method to the madness, and even though we don't
Absolutely.
understand it, doesn't mean that it's not valid or very much needed.
My favorite is like, well, what have you done? You're not reading the book. Get back into place. Get back into line. And I'm like, you shouldn't do that with the bees. They know what they're doing. There's a reason to this. But I love, to your point, that cloaking and that mask of stink.
Yeah,
That's kind
right.
of impressive for them to do that. It's just amazing that they're able to camouflage all those pheromone messages basically, and just kind of have that cloaking. It's like Harry Potter level, as far
Yeah,
as I'm concerned.
it's pretty cool. They are fascinating little critters for certain. Um, some of the other things that are a little bit more obvious that would come back to the immune response. So if you look at that individual bee, and that's the individual cell in the body of another organism, just like us, we have our white blood cells, we have our T cells, we have these things that go and they find these bad little viruses and pathogens and they attack them and remove them. The bees also can do the same thing. And we talk about it when we talk about hygienic behavior. Hygienic behavior can be grooming, but it also can be, you know, managing that brood nest. And just like when they find a bee that is ailing, who maybe can't get out or hasn't got out and should, and they will remove it, they do the same thing to the larva and to the pupa as well. If they find one that is affected or has died or has a disease, they will actually
Mm-hmm.
open up that cell and take it out. Bald brood is something that actually is not necessarily a bad thing, because when they open
Mm-hmm.
up that, they are actually killing the thing
The
that's
mice.
affecting the larva,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not killing the larva or the pupa, and it still
Correct.
goes through and evolves, but it disrupts those cycles, and it's a way for them to go through and help. So again, there's a reason for it. If you see your bees doing
Yeah.
strange things like that, that's actually a good hygienic trait, and it's not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily a bad thing. Now, why they're doing it, what's causing them to do it, that could be a whole different story, but the fact that they are doing it is very, very, very beneficial to that colony.
Right, and that hygienic behavior can also lead them to uncap and recap several times as they come and back and check and make sure that everything is all right. But like you said, opening it up and leaving it open is really going to put a damper into the mite expansion. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. Although I would say you got to be mindful of the fact that sometimes those uncapped cells might be a sign of wax moth infestation tunneling underneath. So it depends how, and you have to kind of look into it a little bit still.
Yeah,
But usually if it's a hygienic behavior, it's a good thing. And
very true.
something that you actually want to see into your colonies. Now, if you see a whole lot of it, that means you might have a whole lot of mites that they're taking care of. So I would question the quality of the queen, basically. Always go back to the forest behind the trees.
Yeah.
Everybody will say it's the mites, it's the mites, it's the mites. No, that's not the biggest problem that the bees have. The queens are the biggest problems that the colonies have. And if you have a poor quality queen, there's no amount of chemical and foreign substances you can put into a hive that's going to sustainably and for extended period of time maintain that colony thriving and potentially alive, because that means you have an underlying problem. And if you don't address the root cause, you're never going to get away with more and more medication. Is not going to help you out. So just be mindful of that as well.
Well, and the queen is a two-pronged approach as well. So you've got the queen. She's very obvious. We all are very familiar with her. What we often take for granted are the drones that the queen is mated with, because just like the chemicals that we put into the colonies to go through and treat for things like mites, just like they affect her development and they affect her reproductive systems, they're also affecting the drones. And so she can go out and she can mate with 75 different drones and have a huge genetic variance in there. But if all of those drones have subpar quality semen and genetic material to donate, then you still end up with a queen who cannot perform, even though it may not necessarily be her fault. She may have developed perfectly, but what she mates with, that's the other half of it too.
Well, and that's my big point when I tell people it's easier to do treatment-free beekeeping in an area where you have more treatment-free beekeepers than in an area where you have mostly treating beekeepers, because what happens is that those drones from treated colonies have subpar genetics, have subpar sperm, and they contribute a disproportionate amount to the queen spermatheca of unviable or poor quality sperm and lower genetic diversity. So you end up, even when you're trying to get local queens and you're not treating, it's harder for you to raise good quality, well-mated queens in those areas. And so that's something to keep in mind. And in those cases, if you're really struggling with that, I would recommend at that point to bypass and forego the local component of the equation of using local survivor stock, meaning local naturally thriving stock, and importing a good quality, well-mated queen from survivor stock from another area that does not basically overwhelm with treated stock. So that's something to keep in mind. Hey, we haven't talked about grooming. And it's basically when the bees are brushing themselves off and getting rid of those ectoparasites, those mites, and those things that are hanging on from their bodies, and just brushing it off. And it's just kind of, it can be done between, they can groom themselves off individually, or they can help each other groom themselves off. So that's another colony level / individual level multi-pronged strategy. And it has several effects. So basically, you can groom those and get rid of some of those pests, but you can also, what it does is that it lowers the direct level of exposure to some of those viruses and those microbes that are getting transmitted by those pests. It also lowers the exposure to the queens to some of those bacteria that are heat killed by the other bees that are taking care of her. So there's a kind of we were talking about that vaccination effect. So basically you have a low direct exposure by keeping those levels really at a minimum. It's same at the queen level, and she can pass that down to her eggs and her progeny, which is really a way to basically vaccinate the bees, the individual bees in the colony. And that's a really great way to do this. But however, I would say that when you have a lot more social grooming, that can take care of those vaccinations. But if you have a lot of issues, or if you have too much of that grooming, you actually can potentially do the reverse and expose more bees to those pests and to those diseases by disseminating it wider into the colony. So it's especially true if that grooming happens with the foragers coming back that are more exposed to those pathogens. So that's another, the grooming is a wonderful thing that the bees do to take care of their immunity, basically. So I don't want to forget about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, when I was mentioning the hygienic behavior, I said it very briefly because I wanted to go off on the other part. But yeah, the actual cleaning of themselves is a huge part there. Now, when you were talking about like inoculating the queen, they are actually doing some research and some studies out there right now with for all intents and purposes, basically an immune booster that they are trying to give to the queens. They feed it to the queen. The queen's body then adapts and assimilates it, and then she passes it on genetically to the offspring and to the children. And so they're trying to figure out kind of how to use that to their advantage and use that natural mechanism and process to be able to maybe someday give an immune booster, to colonies and help boost some of these things up. So there's some really interesting things out there in science. Some of them are fascinating. Some of them are terrifying.
Terrifying.
Some of them you sit there and you're like, have you ever watched any horror movie ever? Like, don't you know this is a bad idea?
Yes. So, I mean, you could argue until you're blue in the face about vaccines and boosters and some of that RNAi and things like that. And, but I think that all in all, what I keep in mind is that the colony has so many strategies that they're able to leverage to keep their immune system high and have high defense against the problems that they can encounter with diseases, that I'd rather trust them to do that, because the unintended consequences of bringing in some of those things that we think are going to help them out, whether it be even probiotics, even some of those boosters that you're talking about, we know that it might have some positive effects. We do not know what all the unintended consequences of those are and how it kind of probably propagates throughout the colony, because it is a superorganism. And we don't even begin to understand all the interactions that are going on at the colony level. So that's something that the fewer foreign substances I can put in my colonies, the better off I am. Now, I will say what I'm doing right now is I'm putting together mushroom beds. And the reason is because bees will forage on mycelium and get some of those compounds that are found in mushrooms that are actually very potent and self-medicating by foraging not only on those resins for the propolis, but also on those mycelium type of things. So rather than me deciding what I'm going to put in there, what kind of probiotic strain I'm going to put in there, what kind of mycelium I'm going to put there, or some kind of supplement I'm going to give them, I'm going to bring it outside and let them choose themselves what they need to do. And I believe strongly that's the best way to go, because they know better than we do every time.
That's very true. And that is a future topic actually for the main podcast that we'll do in the 4th season. We will do an entire episode or 2 on fungi and mycelium and mushrooms, and we'll have a special guest on to help walk us through that process.
Is that Dr. Stimich?
It might be, yes.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. I can't believe it. I'm keeping my fingers crossed then.
Yep. Yeah, so we're going to go through and we're going to talk about that more in depth as well. So from the horror movie standpoint of it, there's talk, and I don't remember which pesticide and chemical company at the moment it was that's doing it. I think purposefully blocked that out. But they were going through and they were doing genetic research on how they could alter the bee by turning on or off a protein basically that was required by the mite. So when the mite feeds on the bee, it ends up taking this thing in that doesn't supposedly hurt the bee, but it disables or kills the mite. It either makes them infertile or it straight up kills them because it shuts down a receptor that needs to actually take in, certain things or produce certain things for the mite to continue functioning. And when I hear things like that, I'm like, yeah, okay, so that could be viable, but the problem is what they are looking at is just the bee and the mite. They're not looking at anything outside of that. So they can say, well, it doesn't affect the bee and it doesn't affect the colonies and you're good, and it only affects varroa mites. It doesn't affect XYZ. But then I always have that horror movie sci-fi thought in the back of my head. I'm like, but what about some other insect? Because a mite is still an insect. What about some other insect that also feeds on bees? And then it feeds on the bee, and maybe that has some sort of, mutation that happens to that insect, or it kills that insect. And, and then that insect is something that is fed on by some other thing or some little mammal or some lizard, and how does that receptor, either activated or not activated, how does it affect these other things? Because all you looked at was the mite and the bee. You didn't look at any other thing that could be related to a mite, or any other insect out there that might eat a bee, or any, reptile that might eat a bee. Yeah. So that it's always, like you said, unintended consequences.
Absolutely. That's a perfect example for this. And if you think about it, the bees actually use some of the some biological controls in the colony. They'll use pseudoscorpions, for example, those predators of mice, to kind of keep them as bay as well. So if we, for any reason, this would be an example, affects their efficiency or transform them in some kind of like, monster from, that's been mutating or something, then we can potentially have some of those unintended consequences. And some of those mechanisms that are inside the colony might actually be disrupted by some of those actions. So something to keep in mind. But if we go now to the back to the colony level, there's other things that the colonies will do. There's, everybody's always fascinated by that social fever. And then they use they'll use that to get rid of some of predators, some wasps that come in, they get balled. They'll get rid of some queens by balling them. But also at the colony level, they are able to actually raise the temperature of the colony to levels that will kill some of those diseases and pests and pathogens, and remain within the threshold that's viable for them.
Yeah.
So that's something that the colony does.
It's just like you having a fever, your body running a temperature and raising itself to kill a pathogen, parasite, or virus. That's exactly the same thing that the colony is doing. Again, it's like the colony is an animal, an organism. And when those bees do that and they generate that heat, they raise it up to a level that's literally just within a degree or a fraction of a degree from their threshold. And they maintain it as long as they can until they've knocked down that pathogen or pest that was in there.
That's how it's like for humans having 104 fever for several days, right? So you're kind of like barely hanging on, and it's kind of like the limit of what your body can take as an adult. But then, that helps you get rid of some of the problems that are inside your body. So I don't like to anthropomorphize, but that's one equivalence from that standpoint. And this being said, I wanted to caution people, we're talking about self-induced social fever that the colony will do and be able to control very precisely. If we are the ones that are applying the heat, like I've seen some of the systems where you use solar or whatever, just I forget what they're called.
They use like an infrared thing that comes on and it's supposed to help with mites, and
or some kind of roof that is powered by battery, and they'll just kind of basically cook the colony to levels that are supposedly too high for the pest, but still viable for the colony. But I've heard a whole lot of horror stories about brood kills and even potentially queens being damaged by those extreme temperatures because they're not necessarily controlled the way that the bees need to have them controlled. They know better every time. They know better.
And if you're doing that, if you're imposing this on a colony that the colony themselves doesn't think that they need it, they're going to spend their entire time fighting against it. So they're going to be bringing in water and dispersing it and fanning it and trying to cool it back down. And you're diverting the resources and the workforce from what they should be doing over to now trying to combat this added heat. But the brood temperature has to be at a very, very specific range. And if it's a degree lower, they can actually develop slower. And if it's a degree higher, they can develop quicker. But when that happens, some things could be skipped in the developmental process, or they could be injured in some way. It's not a good thing. And so, it's the same as the concept of the chemicals. You're trying to affect an insect on an insect, and it's really hard to do without affecting the other insect. It makes it very, very tricky. So
I love my little hit earbud, and I was like, I can't hear what he's saying anymore.
It jumped out of your ear.
Yes, it did. My brain exploding. But there's another aspect. So that's all the way at the end of the spectrum where they do it as they need to and in the way that they control and that we should let them control. But the last resort is also the absconding. They use that when there's not enough nutrition, but also when there's too much diseases in the bird's nest. And they're just kind of like, we can't clean this up. We can't keep going. We're overwhelmed. We're going to leave brood and whatever food is left that we're not taking with us. And we're going to do a last resort, last foray and try to find clean slate so that they can start over with all that work, that load of disease, basically.
Yeah. Africanized bees, the bees with the Scutellatta genetics to them are very adept at that process. If they think they've got too many mites, all right, let's raise a ton of brood, cap them and lock them all in, and then we're leaving.
Pack up and go. And then you make a good point. They will raise the brood to cap those mites in there so that they're not sporadic, and then they'll leave.
Yep. They do it on purpose. They're like,
Yeah,
here you
so
go.
that's
Plenty
amazing.
of nice, cozy little homes. All right, let's shut the door and
Look
lock
at all
it.
those
Bye.
babies. Look at all those sweet babies. Sweet for
Yep.
you guys.
Yeah.
Get out of here.
And then they just sacrifice them all.
It's brutal, but you know what? Again, it works.
It's true. Nature can be harsh sometimes. That's for certain.
Mm.
Well,
So, yep.
thank you for taking us down that very windy, twisty path of the different immune systems of the bees. I actually learned some different things there, and there's always big words. So, you know, those are fun.
Well, I mean, you have some really good points that I have never thought about as well. So, I mean, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope our listeners did too.
I do as well. So everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. And as Natalie just literally said, we hope that you enjoyed. And we will be back with you next week with more little beekeeper chats here and new topics to discuss. So tune in. And until then, everybody, be good.
Be mindful.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
This Hive Jive production was made possible by amazing patrons like you, and we appreciate your support. To all our Hive Jive junkies out there, you truly are the bee's knees.